This is a Coffee Break exclusive. Our guest host, April Sands, talks with the leader of the Progressive Liberal Party, the Honorable Philip Brave Davis.
Welcome everyone to our fourth episode of Coffee Break. I'm your guest host, April Sands. We are here with a very special guest today. He is the Member of Parliament for Cat Island, Rum Key, and San Salvador. He's also the leader of Her Majesty's Opposition, which then in return makes him the leader of the Progressive Liberal Party. Please welcome with me none other than the Honorable Philip Brave Davis, QC. How are you?
I'm fine, and thank you for having me today on your show.
Thank you. You look good, first of all.
Well, I'm happy to hear that.
Yes, welcome, and welcome back home. This is my first time seeing you, and I know that many persons would have informed me that this was your first time out of the country. I hope you were able to get some sightseeing in.
Well, unfortunately not. I was basically in prison. My daughters kept me. I dubbed them my chief wardens because they indicated to me time to rest.
Yeah.
This interruption in your life gave you the moments to stop, pause, and think and rest. And so with my two daughters, I just rested. No sightseeing. I recovered. I'm healthy now. I'm ready to go.
Well, just in case persons don't know, that was a joke, obviously. I know it's not your first time out of the country, but of course that was the running joke, right? But of course you made a decision to leave home to get that help, to get that type of care out of the country. Persons criticized you for that decision. Why did you ultimately make it? I know you spoke of your daughter, but can you clear that out maybe?
Well, first of all, I must congratulate and thank the care that I received at Doctors Hospital. The doctors, the nurses were exceptionally professional. I thank them for the treatment I got because I think that initial treatment is what propelled me to be as healthy as I am today. The doctors in the United States commended the service I got here in Nassau. So it was not about any mistrust here, but it was rather a family decision. I have a daughter who is a medical professional. She is an anesthesiologist and a critical care doctor. She decided that she wanted dad in the States where she could have a hands-on approach and look at what was happening to me. And with that decision, I decided I will go to the United States. She was a graduate of McGill University, Georgetown University, Harvard University, and she did a fellowship at Stanford. One of her mentors from Stanford now heads the infectious department at Emory Hospital where I went, and she decided that that's where I ought to be. And with the family, we decided, well, why not? And I'm thankful to be able to have a daughter who was giving back to her father, and I was really moved just to see the satisfaction in her face and my other daughter's face as to what they were doing for their father.
Yeah.
And I was pleasantly moved by their compassion and love that they shared. That was a silver lining of all this experience for me.
I can imagine. I mean, clearly she sounds, and I think many persons would have noted this after finding out who your daughter was, that she was highly qualified to take care of you. And that would have been an easy decision, I'm sure, to make. So
it was an easy decision.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with the professional or care that I got here at Doctors Hospital. As I said, I commend the service I got. I thank those doctors and nurses, and I will continue to do so. It also brought to my attention the need for us to pay more respect, and we ought to hold these first responders in this pandemic in high esteem that we have done so. It's time for us to listen to them, listen to their cries, and respond to what they need, which we have not been doing. And so I take my hat off to those first responders and to Doctors Hospital and those nurses and doctors that took fantastic care of me.
how was it for you? I'm sure many persons were concerned. Many persons send their thoughts and prayers. How was it for you? Did you experience serious symptoms or mild symptoms? How were you?
Well, the truth of the matter is that I was not feeling as sick as I really was.
Okay.
The diagnosis of my illness had me in serious condition, but I was not feeling it. It's only when I got into the hospital, and I guess it was more psychosomatic than anything else, that I started feeling a bit worse than I was when I was at home. But that was the extent of my experience. I was experiencing shortness of breath, and at the end of the day, they said my oxygen level had fallen to a precarious level, and they had to bring that back up to the level that it ought to be. But at the end of the day, as I said, the experience I don't wish on anyone, and I urge our people to take note that this invisible enemy that's out there, we catch it, we don't know how. I to this day cannot say how I got infected, and we need to pay attention. Follow the protocols. Wear your mask. Wash your hands. Keep distance. And at the end of the day, we will, all together, working together, will defeat this unseen enemy.
I want to ask you also about that. I understand that while you were in the hospital, you were still making phone calls. You were still busy. Is that true? Were you resting, or were you still in work mode?
I was in work mode, and that was why my daughters actually confiscated my phones from me and the laptop for several days, because I continued to work. I continued to try to reach out to persons, and people were reaching out to me. It's very difficult. I'm just so accustomed to working,
moving,
and doing things that it was the boredom. The boredom to me was more excruciating than the pain I was receiving from the virus. And the only way I could have gotten out of the boredom, of course, was to work.
Yeah.
Eventually, my daughters, they understood that, and so I was being given limited period of time on my phones and my laptop.
I want to ask you, a lot of persons know that you've been on the political scene for some time. However, people still, and this is from my own research, people still don't really know who you are, even down to your name. Your name, Brave, well, that's not, as I would have recently found out, is not even your legally given, it's not your birth given name. Where did that name come from?
Well, first of all, yes, I've been in politics for quite a while, but as a true member of a team, you must know the lane that you travel in. The lane that I've traveled in over the many years was one of follower and supporting those who led. And therefore, very often, your role as a follower is very often overshadowed by those who you follow, because you are in their shadows. At the end of the day, I am now leading, and yes, people will get to know me. Fortunately for me, my life story has been one of service, service to Bahamian people, and those whose lives I would have touched over the many years could speak for me. And that's all I have been doing all my life. I am from humble beginnings. You call the name Brave. Well, that was the name of my father. My father was a young man who was, in fact, brave, dedicated, and committed. He was brave enough in the early 50s to stand up against that day's oligarchy who were oppressing us, the Black Bahamians. And so he joined the political party of the Progressive Party at a very early age. And even though he became a civil servant, never shied away from letting his views known about where we are and where we ought to be going as a people. That was his given name. I, as a little boy, grew up in Cat Island. My father and mother, who were functionally literate, at the age of just over 1 or 2, I was sent to Cat Island and was brought up by my grandparents, who were illiterate, cannot read or write. They were subsistence farmers. We lived off the land, as we said in those days. What I ate was what we grew or what we picked off the trees. And there were no grocery stores. What we depended on back then, we were hoping that when the boat came, a box would be there with what we call relish, maybe a can of corned beef or tuna, and that is what we relied on. And that's how I grew up. I want to talk about clothing, because that was scant at best. And that is where I grew up. I then came back to Nassau to live with my parents. And as I indicated, my father was but a fireman or a crash crew member at the airport, where he worked for most of his life and where he retired. My mother was a maid. She worked. She was a maid in homes on the Eastern Road, and eventually she did a course at the Dundas Civic Center, and she felt so gratified that she got a promotion. And that promotion or graduation was that she was able to get a job as a maid at Beach Inn Hotel on Paradise Island, where she worked until she retired. So my mother was a maid at the Beach Inn. My father was a fireman, and they brought up 8 children. But they all knew, both of them understood, particularly my father, that at the end of the day, all right, that the key for success, that he worked hard, as my grandfather worked hard in the fields of Cat Island to try to make life a little better for his children. My father worked hard, likewise, to make life a little easier for us. And they did that in the context that each generation had to pivot to the point where to understand what the times were saying. When my father was working hard, he understood by that time that education was the key. And that's where he pushed all of his children to get a good education. His dream for me was to become a doctor.
Oh, wow.
Unfortunately, I disappointed him. And eventually that disappointment turned into one of being proud, because I became a lawyer eventually. And he followed my career and was proud that I made the best out of what opportunities were provided to me in that profession. And so for me, my story is what kind of drives me to where I am today, because I don't know that today persons who were born in my circumstances, who are now saddled with more of the modern conveniences that we would not have had in those days, who are now more distracted by the tech world that we are now living in, would have the opportunities, would be able to arrive at levels in this society that I have. Put another way, would they be able to dream and dream big? Would they be able to not only dream and dream big, but achieve those dreams without obstacles being put in their way? I sense today that many obstacles have been put into the way of many of our young, ordinary Bahamian people to flourish and blossom, to be that which they could be in this country. That's why I'm here, because I am about to do what is necessary to move all those obstacles. And so you can be what you want to be in this country.
Was your plan always to hopefully become prime minister, or did you see yourself in other roles? I mean, what did you map out for yourself?
But truth be told, I always had a sense of service. This is one of the things that was imbued in me by my father and grandfather. It wasn't where you were in life. It is what you do in life. So whether I was to become prime minister, whether I was just to be a lawyer, whether I was just to be an MP, whatever I was, wherever I arrived at, is what I was doing to impact the lives of the ordinary Bahamian. Not forgetting from whence I would have come, and not forgetting those who would have been where I came from and reaching out a hand to help them to go where they wish. And so that is what drove me. And that I am now in this position to be the next Prime Minister of the Common Bahamas. That is intriguing for me because it then gives me the opportunity to impact lives and to ensure that I'm now in a position to do things for the Bahamian people, particularly removing those obstacles, removing those shackles, removing the yoke that keeps the ordinary Bahamian from achieving that which they could achieve without those obstacles hindering them.
And I want to speak a little bit about the times that you would have already spoken to a little bit when you were behind the scenes. Because this has been an idea that I guess the current administration has, I guess, almost used against you to speak of you being a person who has been around too long, needs to throw in the towel. But in fact, their qualifications that you have kind of come to have now. And instead of uplifting, I find this just in our time now, instead of uplifting the idea of qualifications, we kind of throw down the idea of qualifications. What do you speak to that?
Well, first of all, I think that it does not all go well for the development of any society to discard experience. Qualifications in and of itself is not the end all to being able to succeed, and or it is not what speaks to competence. Put another way, qualifications and competence are not synonymous. You may be qualified, but not competent. Experience, though, is what informs competence. So if you're qualified and you're experienced, that ought to equal competence. And I think what I have been around, yes, I was following. And what comes out of the question really is, what is one's ambition? Ambition is a good thing. In fact, I am one who applaud persons with ambition, because that drives you to plan, to achieve that ambition. Yes, I was ambitious, but I did not allow my impatience or my youthful impatience to drive my ambitions. Because patient ambitions is the best route to achieving that which you desire, which informs that ambition. And so, whatever they were to say, I think my time in politics to date makes me qualified for the job, but not just qualified, but gives me sufficient experience to do the job.
So I want to shift gears a little bit here with you, because we do have a lot of ground to cover. But throughout this pandemic, the Prime Minister, along with a lot of world leaders, have found themselves in very tough decision-making processes, right? A lot of persons would have either found themselves either forgiving some of the decisions that have been made now, just out of pure innocence. Maybe they feel as though these are, of course, unprecedented times. And so that means now leaders are faced with tough decisions, or they find themselves frustrated with some of the decisions that are made from leaders now. There's also a debate amongst whether getting through this pandemic has something to do with behavioral factors or governance. I want to know from your standpoint, is it more important to focus on what we do as a people in terms of whether that means wearing the masks, staying 6 feet apart, or washing our hands, or is the focus to be on the governance and the restrictions made from higher powers. What do you think?
Well, first of all, let's start from the premise that we are dealing with a health crisis that is very, very challenging. Leadership, though, is required in dealing with it. Our people will follow what leaders do. People will comply with what leaders fix as the rules. So when you talk about the behavioral aspects of the incident against that is used for the fight, we have to look at it in the context of what the leaders are doing and what the leaders are regulating. Now, in the context of the world, I think if we follow what was happening in the world, we will find that where there has truly been an absence of leadership and an absence of leaders being role models for their citizenry, that is where the pandemic has seemed to be out of control. And that there's no handle on it. Fast forward and be at home. I don't think that we, as a country, in our approach to this enemy, should be in the position we are in. This is not inevitable where we are. Just today, I'm understanding we have over the last week, for example, the average amount of new cases have been in the neighborhood of over 90. We are told this morning that it may be much more than it is because it has been admitted that the government has been under-reporting. Now, it is clear that something has gone wrong. Policies will dictate the successes that we would have against this virus. Having had no success, we can tie it then directly to what the policies were. And I say that the policies have been bad. For we shut down the country in March, we reopened in July. When we reopened, if you look at the number of deaths, I think it was under 20. If you look on the number of cases we had, it was under 100. When we reopen in July and look at where we are today, one has to ask themselves, well, what have we been doing? And what is more telling and what is more troubling is that the centers of where the virus is contracted are government institutions. Yesterday, a friend of mine went to the hospital. Not yesterday, he died yesterday, having gone to the hospital for a procedure, contracting COVID, and died. So why is that? Why can't we go to public institutions and feel safe? Obviously, something is wrong. It has to relate to our policies. And clearly, what is happening here, there is truly no plan. From day one, we've been questioning. They claim that we have been criticizing. We have not been criticizing. We have provided, through my COVID task force, several recommendations. I think we sent at least 4 reports on what we were seeing happening and collating information that we're getting worldwide and trying to come with a science and a plan. And we have submitted that to the government just for their consideration. But it is just clear to me that it is the government's dysfunction when it comes to this. And it is just, they have taken the approach, I think it is what it is. And that is sad.
In presenting that information, did they get back to you? What was the response in that?
No, they did not get back to me. And my task force chair and co-chair, Dr. Michael Dowell and Dr. Melissa Evans, have not indicated to me that they got back to them.
Mm. You feel as though with a pandemic like this or a crisis like this, there should have been a partnership between the two parties.
Yes, well, we offered.
Yeah.
We offered to lend our assistance. In fact, I gave some. When Dr. Dwayne Sands was there, he graciously allowed us to meet with the COVID task force. We were able to question them. We understood that there were some gaps. We made some recommendations to them, and a number of them were not accepted. And I dare say that if they were, we would not be in the condition we are in today.
I want to also talk economically as well. Unemployment is obviously at an all-time high for us. We know that other countries have presented their locals with stimulus checks, or at least checks to help navigate persons and families throughout this very difficult time that everyone is experiencing. Just recently, well, this week, of course, we know that the Minister of NIB has deducted the weekly unemployment checks, which started from $200 to then $150, and now it's $100. Bahamians, it's safe to say, are, enduring this pandemic, I think, with a lot of graciousness, just because of all the sporadic decisions that have been made from the Prime Minister, and then also in return, not getting what I would think is the support that we as the people really need at this time. Why do you think it's been so difficult to get that support? Because even in making some of the wrong decisions, shouldn't it had at least been obvious to present the people with the support they needed?
Yeah. But we do not just have a health crisis. We have an economic crisis. And first of all, to appreciate the economic crisis, it requires you to have a heart for your people. It requires you to have an appreciation of where they are. And it requires you to be able to respond quickly to those people's needs. That is absent from this government. And quite frankly, they are reaping today what they sowed prior to Dorian and the pandemic. Because I remind you and the Bahamian people that in June of last year, 2019, I warned the Bahamian people and the government that if they did not quickly reverse some of their fiscal policies, right, we would be in serious fiscal difficulties. I then said we are heading over a fiscal cliff, right, because of what I call bad policies, decisions, choices, and priorities made by this government prior to Dorian, right? They don't now have the headroom in their fiscal policies to now render the assistance that is truly necessary to our people. And instead of attempting to find ways and means of doing it, all they're doing is cutting.
So due to previous decisions, we would have been here inevitably, of course, after the pandemic. We didn't have a chance. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that they ought to be doing more for our people. Mm-hmm. They're unable to do more. Decisions made by them prior to Dorian, which I warned about in June last year. That's what they sowed. They're now reaping it, and they're unable to respond to the needs of our people as a result of those decisions. Mm-hmm. It is not about just Dorian. It's not just about the pandemic, but it's about decisions made even prior to that. Mm-hmm. And they need to find a way to look after our people. I think they indicate that they're spending $1 million a week on food, but what is that? Mm-hmm. And the amount of hungry mouths out there. Yeah. Right? And it's not just food. People are now being put out of their homes. Mm. Right? There's supposed to be a rental assistance program.
what should be done right? Well, you just would have mentioned it. What are the things that should be in place right now that Bahamians can feel and take away from?
But what should be in place now is a proper social social program to ensure that people are able to eat, to ensure that people have a roof over their head, that and able to live under that roof with some modicum of comfort, with just the bare essentials. That should be in place right now. Yeah. The government ought to have, and they should have, sufficient revenue to at least do that, to bide us over this period. You see, when they ought to have known that a lockdown was going to have some economic consequences, and so they ought to have planned. They know that other countries that our tourism product would have been impacted. They ought to have taken that into account and consider how the domestic economy could have been utilized to fill that gap. But you locked down the domestic economy, and you did not plan properly that look, the consequences of a lockdown would be this. They ought to have known, and they ought to have prepared themselves for that consequence.
Well, should we actually be getting stimulus checks?
I think the government, you call it a stimulus check. I prefer to call it a social assistance, because stimulus has what I call stated some meaning, have a meaning to it that may not apply here. But what I would say is that we should have been providing cash in the hands of Bahamian people so they could decide how they would wish to utilize it. Because when I talk to people about the food program, they get the same thing every week. So, for example, corned beef every week. Well, maybe if you give me the money in hand, instead of buying corned beef, I may buy sausage for it, at least to switch up my diet. So I think it would be more meaningful. It would provide more dignity to our people if they're able to have cash in their hand so that they could decide how they're going to spend that cash to keep them alive.
I'm really surprised that it's just not even a conversation. I'm trying to figure out why we are missing even that, just being able to talk and speak up. But I guess, as you would have mentioned, they don't have the resources. Is that why we're not having the conversation even?
What I say about the resources, they have resources.
Okay.
It is the choices that they're making for the utilization of those resources and the priorities they're placing in its utilization. So it boils down to two things: choices and priorities. Now, when I say that they have resources, it is not the amount of resources that they ought to have had if they did not make the decisions I spoke about earlier. Right? It is. I accept that it is shrunk. I accept it is shrunk. That it is not. If I call it the pie is not as large as it ought to be or it used to be. But at the end of the day, when you cut that pie up to share, you're going to make the choice as to how am I going to share, and it does not appear that the sharing of the pie is going to the most needy amongst us.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about the party, the PLP, of course. What do you think people want from the PLP, and have you been able to listen to people after, of course, last election? I know that was some time ago. However, I want to know, what is the plan for the PLP moving forward?
Well, first of all, the plan is to recapture the government. And immediately after the loss in 2017, I embarked upon a listening tour throughout the length and breadth of the country and on the island of Providence. And three things struck me. One, and that is that the majority of the persons I spoke to believe that the Progressive Liberal Party was the party for the Bahamian people, the small man. Secondly, they all understood and agreed that the foundations of this modern Bahamas were laid by the hands of the Progressive Liberal Party. And thirdly, they also understood that the voice of the people is better heard, right, and articulated through the Progressive Liberal Party. And so, that caused me to pause. If this is so, why did we lose?
Mm-hmm.
And not just lose, but lose so badly. Mm-hmm. And what I sense, and the common denominator that emerged from those discussions, is that they had lost trust in the Progressive Liberal Party. Mm-hmm. And hence, my job and what I've been doing over the last several years and months was to regain that trust, working on regaining that trust. I think we are there. Where are we going from there? Well, what we are going to ensure, we're going to ensure, as I told my story earlier at the beginning of this interview, we're going to ensure that the Progressive Liberal Party remove any and all obstacles that will be that are in the way of the ordinary Bahamian achieving his or her goal, that would be in the way of empowering them to be citizens of the country that would lift themselves up from being ordinary to being extraordinary.
One of the things that this pandemic has brought to our attention is how fragile it is for a country to rely so critically on just one industry. And we've seen and we've experienced now the repercussions of that. As a future leader of this country, what do you say to that? Are there other industries that we should be more focused on at this moment?
Well, certainly. And let us not just say that the pandemic has brought to fore the fallacy and folly of relying on one industry. We've had other instances that ought to have alerted our attention to that. For example, 9/11 and other events over the years that ought to remind us that we ought to have been diversifying our economy. The next government of this country, led by Philip Brave Davis, will no doubt be moving away from that dependency. So, for example, I have several committees that are now working. They're reporting to me about ways and means of diversifying the economy. I have an economic council. I have a council that deals with the various aspects of our economy to be able to report what we ought to be doing. So, for example, the orange economy, where we develop the creative arts, creative industry, to ensure that we be able to export and develop some of the talent and exploit some of the talents we have here. We have many talents. We have sports. We could attract some international sporting events here that we have been doing before. We have talented Bahamian athletes that we can develop their skills and have them move abroad in markets where they can earn a living sufficient to help build our own economy. And then, of course, music and filmmaking. All those go into the orange economy, where we were developing, paying more attention to our agricultural and food security issues, to minimize the amount of import that impacts our economy. And in the blue economy, we have 100,000 square miles of water, and there's a lot of resources under our waters and in our waters that needs to be exploited. So emphasis will be placed on those aspects of our natural resources and our human capital and our talents, and we develop those to ensure that the dependency on tourism is lessened. We will not do away with tourism because it's acknowledged that tourism is one of the fastest engines for economic growth. But we're not going to allow that engine to leave behind all of these other aspects that we could develop of our economy.
But I want to also just put my own little insert in there. I feel like culturally and the arts has been such a missed opportunity for us as a country. We don't focus in on, like you would have just mentioned, our talents. Most of my peers, including myself, most of my peers and inclusive of myself, we have gone to school now to study things like production, television, movie directing. You have people that are now just in the fields of arts. You see very rarely now that young people are studying maybe other things. And so I think there's such a critical opportunity in that. And we've seen other countries benefit from their entertainers or celebrities or that kind of thing. And that's how you bring in now tourism. And that's how you now get, to bring in even economic wealth through persons who you're able to uplift, athletes, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So I think that's such a critical point.
Yeah, when I first talked about the diversification, I mentioned human capital. We have the human capital here. But if we only just rely on saying, well, the human capital is here, there's another aspect to that. And that's what I call human capacity. We have to develop the capacity of our people as well. And therein lies the role of the government to ensure that we invest in our human capital to ensure it produces human capacity to grasp the opportunities. That's not just here, but it's out there as well. Because I believe that Bahamians are world-class people in whatever they do and whatever endeavor they would wish to embrace. We just need to let them believe that, let them know that, and show them the way to that.
I think that seamlessly now leads us into my very next question. But what does a Davis administration look like for the future of this country?
Well, you've had a glimpse from what I've said before. But one thing that the country could look forward to, they could expect and appreciate that there's a brave new world on the horizon. And that world will ensure that we have a gentler, kinder Bahamas that will be led by a government that cares, a government that will be competent, and a government that will not pay more attention to what I call the physical deficit, but that will pay more attention to the social deficit. When we speak about fiscal deficit, as this government does, they pat themselves on the back, they self-congratulate themselves by saying, look how look what we're doing with the deficit. We are shrinking the deficit, right? And you do that at the expense of our people.
That was a primary focus of this administration.
That's what it was before Dorian and the pandemic. But in the meantime, they ignored the social deficit, which continued to widen. That will not be a Philip Brave Davis administration, because we believe in the dignity of our people. We will not I appreciate that wherever the fiscal deficit widens, I call it a debit. And wherever there's a debit, there has to be a credit. So where the fiscal deficit widens, you'll expect that you'll find that credit in how your people live, how you measure the happiness of the family, and how a husband and wife could see their children going to school, being proud to see them graduating, being proud to see them going off to tertiary education, coming back, having grandchildren. That is the happiness that we see. That's how we measure the success of your economy, not by the metrics of whether the fiscal deficit has been shrunk or whether you have a balanced budget. Those are laudable goals, but you cannot allow those goals to trump what your primary responsibility is. That is to ensure that every man, woman, child in your country lives a life that will ensure that they're happy.
And the irony of that focus was that we still ended up facing harder times while we were in the midst of trying to focus on that debt. We still ended up facing a horrible crisis and a hurricane, then a pandemic. And then so the irony was it didn't even matter. because we still ended up worse.
You're quite right about that, because, when they were bragging about the deficit and what they were going to do about the deficit, whilst they were blaming us, we keep reminding them, look, you just need one hurricane. They didn't believe us, right? When we had Joaquin and Matthew back to back, and we had to, and the fiscal balance seemed to have gone out of whack. They were blaming us. They were saying mismanagement.
Yeah.
Right? They weren't blaming the hurricanes. They were saying mismanagement. We warned them and say, look, you just need one hurricane. Now that they are experiencing it, that's what's ironic.
Yeah.
It is the hurricane. It is the pandemic. It's not mismanagement. But in due course, we'll have a lot of opportunities to point out some of the decisions made that has led us to be in worse position today, despite Dorian, despite the pandemic.
Your style of leadership is one that is so different. I think more different than we've even been able to see as Bahamians. Usually we see a bit of maybe a louder style of a more, a style of just aggressiveness maybe. And you seem to lead, talk, move so much more differently than that. And I think that could be a potential reason as to why Bahamians have so much talk about Brave and him leading and that kind of thing. Can you speak to where that style comes from? And can we handle a leader who moves like that?
Well, I think they can. First of all, I think my style of leadership is born out of my fervent beliefs and values that started in Old White Cat Island. In Sunday school, church, I was always attracted to the Gospels. And the one thing that always springs out at me is that leadership is about serving. It's not about lording over. It's about serving. And so to serve, I think, requires a degree of humility. And so I think whatever people might say about me, they mistake my strength for weakness. But I'm humble. Because I think, as my father always told me, the humble child sees the face of God. They say that I can't speak, but I remind all that when Moses was called, his first response was, Lord, why me? I can't speak. But I say to all those who may have a challenge or difficulty with the way I speak, they might believe I can't speak, but I communicate. I communicate. I've been a lawyer for the last 40 plus years, and I dare say, not an unsuccessful lawyer. I think I've done well. And my trademark is my tongue and being able to persuade. And so sometimes it is rather amusing that they say I can't speak, but I've been so successful in a trade that I have I've done so well. Exactly. It's irony. Yeah. And I just say to them that, listen, I'm not going to be shouting at them. I'm not going to be bamboozling them. I'm going to be talking fact, truth. That's what guides me. My humility is because I understand that for me to be first, I must serve. And it's through my service that I will be what I am, the leader of this country. And leaders must know how to serve. And that's what I'm about. I think some people call it servant leadership. That has been my motto. I'm a consensus builder. I pursue things that make for peace, to build up the common life and the common good. But I dare say, as I often say to those who dare me, nec bella provocandum, nec temendium. I will provoke no war, but I'm not afraid of any.
If I must say, that was powerful. In the words of Rodney Monker, that was powerful. And I hope that if we take anything from this interview, leaders must serve. I think that's so profound. Thank you so much for joining us.
It was my pleasure.
Yes, and thank you all for joining us as well. We're so happy to have you, and of course, have the leader of the Progressive Liberal Party, the Honorable Philip Brave Davis QC. Until our next episode, you will meet us right here, same time, same place, with Coffee Break, and I'm your guest host, April Sands.